This is day 3, part 1 of the killer dentist murder trial. If you haven't been following the case, I'll give you a recap. Please, major trigger warning. This is Dr. Suzanne Mericle. She was a very prominent dentist, had a successful practice in St. Simon's Island prior to her arrest last year. Now, according to reports, she is facing murder charges for allegedly taking the life of her boyfriend, David, back in 2025. According to the state, they had a very toxic relationship. She was very controlling. And when she found out that he was talking to another woman in Moldova and sending him money, that was it. They continued arguing about it for months. And finally, she took his life in March. However, the defense, when their opening statements, says absolutely not. In fact, she was a domestic violence victim who was constantly abused by David. And on that day, she just simply defended herself. Let's get into the first witness on day 3. The first witness is Dr. Stephanie Zhang. She works for Fulton County as a medical examiner. The first thing that they do is ask her of what is your process before jumping into an autopsy. She shares that once the body bag arrives, they make sure that the tag matches the name as well as the case number that they've been provided. She opens the body bag, she examines everything outside of the body, the clothing, any medical devices that they have. She takes pictures to essentially create a record. Once they've done that, they then remove everything. They start washing the body just to see if there are any injuries or any other marks on the body. They then make an incision. At that point, they do an internal exam. They take any blood samples or fingerprints that the state requires them to do. They then go into their process with David. Everything is the same. Wash the body, all of that. They start sharing pictures, which I am surprised that they shared them in the screen for all of the public to see in addition to the jury. At this point, they ask her, did you observe any injuries to his face? She said, yes. The injuries that I observed on the face are a laceration on the bridge of the nose, which you can see in the photograph. Again, they're showing everything. Also, there's small scrapings of the skin and another kind of a partial thickness laceration of the upper lip, a chip of one of the front teeth, and then other abrasions on the face. They continue looking at different areas, going over also all of the photographs that she took during her process. They ask her, there are the different pinpoints that he has. Is that the same or something different than the stippling that would come from a gunshot? So she shares, stippling is a term that we use to describe when a gun is shot due to the gunpowder particles that exit the gun. She shares that stippling are going to look like small dot-like abrasions or red marks. In that case, she says that she can't say that is a fact because she doesn't see a gunshot wound on the nose. However, other objects or particle matter that is striking the skin at a high speed can also cause that type of appearance to look like gunshot particles are striking the skin. Now, they ask her about the lacerations that she's referring to that are showing splitting of the skin. She shares, look, that's not something that essentially comes from a bullet or a gunshot. In fact, something had to strike the person's face or something such as them falling down and hitting their face on the floor would actually then cause that laceration to be there. They go over the gunshot wound and kind of where it entered the body, where it exited. And then she goes on to share that when it came to this particular autopsy, she knew that they were going to find a projectile. And in fact, they did. Once they did the x-ray, they were able to find the projectile inside of the body. And again, they show the pictures that she provided to show the projectile and also to create kind of like an explanation as to where the gunshot went through, what body parts it exited, etc. She breaks down exactly what she determined based on her findings. She shared that the bullet passed through that space between the ribs. After that, it passed through the left lung, the aorta, the right lung, that went through and fractured the right 9th rib. She shares that at that point, that would, of course, be a fatal injury. At this point, she does make it clear that the cause of death is a gunshot wound. The manner of death is homicide. The defense comes in because, keep in mind, the defense has always maintained that he shot at her, and that's why she felt the need to go get a gun to protect herself. But no one has any proof that he shot because there was no test of gunshot residue. According to this doctor in the defense's examination, yes, she in fact did a full kit showing if there was any gunshot residue. She turned it over and it's gone. In fact, she makes it clear that she collected it, she put labels on it, and after that, she didn't do anything because they determine what they're going to use and what they're not going to use. She just completes the test. The defense also asked her, look, if this is a self-defense situation where the person is defending themselves, would you still say that the manner of death is homicide? And she said yes. She also goes on to say that at the end of the day, when he received that gunshot wound, there was no saving him. It was impossible. And I imagine the defense hones in on that because they keep stating that she took a few minutes to call police and she was hysterical instead of trying to help him. And at the end of the day, the medical examiner makes it clear that she could have tried all she wanted to. She was never going to save him after that shot. Let's go into the next witness. The next witness is Kimberly Jewett, who is actually part of the Division of Forensics of the GBI, and she is the manager of the Trace Evidence section. They start questioning her about the gunshot residue, and is that a real thing? She shares that yes, in fact, there's two parts to gunshot residue. First and foremost, you've got the gunpowder. That's the organic portion of the gunpowder, and then there's gunshot primer residue. That is when they're looking at the metals from the primer portion. They proceed to ask her, did you guys receive anything to essentially test from the sheriff's department? And she said no, that they had received something from the medical examiner's office to test, but the moment they realized that he was the victim of a gunshot, at this point they don't test it. And they ask her why, and she says, well, our policy is if they received a gunshot wound, we do not test the kit because we cannot tell you anything more than you already know, and that they were involved in a shooting incident. They then ask, did anybody, Mr. McGregor, who was the manager at the time, because she's only been a manager for 7 months, did he assign the residue to be maybe looked at by an analyst? He did not, because when he read through the case file, again, he noticed that the individual has sustained a gunshot. So what they did is that they released a case information update. They share that he was in fact the victim in the case. And they ask her, what's the reason? What's your policy or the understanding of that policy? The reason would be that if we test a kit, that kit shows gunshot residue on the individual's hands, it means one of three things. Either the individual discharged a firearm, the individual was in the presence of discharging the firearm, or they came into contact with an item whose surface bears gunshot residue. So essentially, if the victim it was shot at, clearly he was in the presence of gunshot residue. He's going to have a gunshot residue, so they do not test at all. The next witness is Gavin Swisecki. He is a forensic toxicologist at the GBI, and a toxicologist apparently analyzes biological urine and blood for the presence or absence of alcohols, poisons, and drugs. He received a sample or multiple samples of David's blood, urine. At the end of the day, they concluded that there was zero alcohol in his system. In the next video, we'll go into the next witnesses, which includes David's son. Talk to you soon.